Mia Catherine Zapata was an American musician who was the lead singer for the Seattle punk band The Gits. The band was rather dominant within the punk grunge scene and had accumulated a large following of fans. Mia herself had been born on August the 25th, 1965, in an upper-middle-class suburb of Louisville, Kentucky. She had learned how to play the guitar and the piano by the age of 9 and was influenced by many talents such as Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, Ray Charles and Sam Cooke. In September of 1986, she and 3 of her friends formed the punk rock band The Gits. In 1989, the band relocated to Seattle, Washington. Mia found a job at a local bar and the 4 band members moved into an abandoned house that they called the Rat House. Mia had come from an affluent family but often lived without material comforts. She could have easily have lived off of her parents' money, but instead she chose to reject this lifestyle and work hard for what she wanted. As her father described it, Mia lived in 2 different worlds. She lived on 2 different sides of the street, the straight side on one, with parochial schools, an affluent family and tennis clubs. But when she crossed that street, material things didn't mean anything to her. The community within Seattle was thriving with new and local bands, trying to make it big. The Gits drummer, Steve Marietta, admitted, "We didn't fit in when we got there." Recalling those early years in Seattle, he explained, "So we had to form our own scene, play our own shows. I think we would have liked to have the attention of a record label and be one of the cool kids on the block, but we weren't. We had to forge our own path." The Gits were fairly unknown around this time. However, word soon began to spread around town about Mia being a charismatic and fiery performer, and with this, the band soon began to gain traction. The Gits released a series of well-received singles on local independent record labels from 1990 to 1991. In 1990, the Gits went on a successful international tour without the support of a record label. This was a very big achievement, especially for that time period. They didn't have platforms such as TikTok, YouTube or SoundCloud back then, and they really did have to build their fan base from the ground up. It took a lot of time and effort to do this. This was a time before the internet, so any attention they got was from raw talent. Not like nowadays, where you can share a video or a song to millions of people for instant exposure. By 1992, the band were making a name for themselves and were able to release their debut album, Frenching the Bully. Their reputation progressively increased within the grunge scene in Seattle, with many comparing the band to that of Nirvana and Pearl Jam. But Mia Zapata brought a voice of femininity to the grunge scene that had not yet been seen before. Although the group was made up of 75% men, the band as a whole, and Zapata in particular, became popular amongst the feminist community of Seattle at that time. Unfortunately, before the band could finish and release their second album, Enter the Conquering Chicken, Mia Catherine Zapata was murdered. In the early hours of July the 7th, 1993, Mia had been out celebrating a successful West Coast tour and grieving a recently lost relationship. She had left the Comet Tavern in the Capitol Hill area of Seattle, reportedly around midnight, to look for her former boyfriend Robert Jenkins at a rehearsal space located in an apartment building around a block away from the bar. Robert wasn't there, and so Mia instead decided to briefly visit her friend who lived on the second floor of the building. She stayed at her friend's home for around 90 minutes before eventually leaving just before 2 a.m. to go home. Her friend pleaded with her not to walk home alone in the dark and to wait for her to phone a taxi, but Mia didn't want to wait. She reassured her friend, that her home was only a few blocks south and she needed to clear her head. She thought the walk might do her some good. Sadly, this would be the last time that Mia was seen alive by someone that she knew. Her body was discovered near an intersection at around 3:30 a.m, located in Seattle's Central District. She had been beaten, raped, and strangled with the cords of her own The Gits sweatshirt. It is believed that she had encountered her attacker shortly after 2:15 a.m, not long after leaving her friend's apartment. Her body was not initially identified, as she had no identification on her when she was found. An episode of the television show Forensic Files revealed that Mia had only been identified after the medical examiner, who was a fan of the Gits and had been to many of their concerts, had recognised her. According to this medical examiner, if Mia had not been strangled, she would have died anyway from the internal injuries that had been suffered from the beating.
Her underwear and brassiere had been stuffed into her pockets. And as would become readily apparent and horrifically apparent, Mia also had been brutally sexually assaulted.
Mia had also been posed after her murder, with her arms spread out like that of Christ the Redeemer. Investigators found scuff marks on Mia's hips and also on the tips of her shoes, pointing to signs that Mia's body had been dragged.
I noticed scuff marks on the toes of her shoes, as a scuff mark on the left side of her hip, on her flesh, as well as on the belt just below that flesh mark. There were other little items, metal pieces that were strewn about the body. Immediately to the east of the victim, approximately 1 foot away from her head, there was a tire residue mark from a vehicle. That ran approximately 13 inches in length.
It was theorised by the police that Mia had actually been killed somewhere else before being dumped on the road. Closer inspection on Mia's clothing found something disturbing. Mia's bra had been ripped open and one of the padded cups had been taken. This indicated that her killer had taken it as a souvenir.
It was noticed that the black brassiere appeared to have been ripped and also cut. It was minus one of the cups for the breast. At this point, both my partner and I thought that our killer took a souvenir with him. There were swabs that were taken from her breast area. These swabs were preserved.
Mia Zapata was interred at Cave Hill Cemetery in her hometown of Louisville. The Seattle music community, including its most famous bands, Nirvana, Pearl Jam and Soundgarden, helped to raise $70,000 to hire a private investigator for 3 years. The funds dried up without any major breaks in the case, but the investigator, Lee Heron, continued to investigate on her own time. In 1998, after 5 years of investigation, Seattle Police Detective Dale Tallman said, "We're no closer to solving the case now than we were right after the murder." Whilst the private investigator produced notebooks full of information and evidence that were later handed over to the authorities, nothing came of it that could lead to the killer. It looked as though Mia Zapata's case would sadly go cold. Then, a major break occurred in December of 2002, when the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab ran a DNA check based on preserved swabs of saliva collected from Mia's body 9 years earlier.
Once the DNA typing profiles were generated, I was able to subtract out Mia Zapata's DNA profile. And when I did do that, I was able to then pull out a single source male profile.
In 2003, Florida fisherman Jesus Misquire, who had come from Cuba in 1980, was arrested and charged in connection with Zapata's murder based on the DNA evidence. A DNA profile had been extracted from saliva that was found on Mia's body and kept in cold storage until the STR technology was developed for full extraction. An original entry in 2001 had failed to generate a positive result, but Mezguia's DNA entered the National CODIS database after he was arrested in Florida for burglary and domestic abuse in 2002. Mezguia had a history of violence towards women, including domestic abuse, burglary, assault, and battery. All of his ex-girlfriends and his wife had all filed reports against him. There was also a report of indecent exposure on file against him in Seattle within 2 weeks of Zapata's murder. However, there were no known prior links between Mezguia and Zapata. Mezguia never testified in his own defense and still to this day maintains his innocence. The theory is that he saw Zapata leaving the bar and followed her a short distance before he decided to attack. Her headset covered her ears, so she would have been unaware of any dangers until he grabbed her and dragged her into his car, where he subjected her to a brutal sexual assault in the back seat. Mezguia was convicted in 2004 and initially sentenced to 37 years, which he later appealed. He was resentenced to 36 years. Mezguia has been in prison since January of 2003. Something that comes up a lot when you research the life of Mia Zapata is the way in which she had a natural ability to connect to people from all walks of life and bring them together through music. This was something that was even brought up by the judge in her trial, with Judge Shavin Armstrong stating that she was struck by how closely Mia had connected to so many people. This speaks volume for the sort of person that Mia was, and it's a shame that she was killed just as she was on the brink of becoming something big.
It was disbelief mostly, and horror at what she must have experienced, and during the final minutes of her life, and how scared she must have been was what went through my mind.
Jesus, were you surprised by the verdict?
Convicted murderer Jesus Mesquia says nothing as he leaves the King County Courthouse. His long stint as a killer on the loose ends.